The devil is real. May God have mercy on us all.
Film's female lead, Ashley Franchosi. I think that's or no, let's go. Ash. I think it's
Today, Junior!
Hello, I just wanted to thank you for clicking on my video, and I wanted to let you know not only do I create content on my YouTube channel here, Class in a Glass, but I'm also on Twitch where I play single-player games, multiplayer games, I do movie reviews, cartoon reviews, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Also, it would be a big help if you can check out my Patreon where you can gain access to audio commentaries, reactions, and the ability to submit questions for my podcasts and videocasts. And all that content can be found in the links below. In the meantime, enjoy the video. I want to go ahead and I want to move on to my review for the last voyage of the Demeter, which, for those of you that don't know, the film focuses on a crew sailing from Carpathia, I believe that's how you say that, to England, and they find that they are carrying very dangerous cargo, the legendary Dracula. Now, before jumping into the review for this film, I do want to kind of share my overall thoughts on Dracula and the vampire subgenre. Dracula is one of history's most iconic monsters. We've gotten some great and some horrible interpretations, of him over the last century, I would say, Chad. The last, 125 years. We've gotten some truly great iterations, like Bela Lugosi's version, Chad. I think for a lot of people, when you first think of Dracula, you think of Bela Lugosi, you think of that 1931 film. And then, later on, during the Hammer horror era, we had, Christopher Lee's version from the horror films. Kind of changed it up, made it a little bloodier, made it a little more graphic, Chad, a little more sexual. A lot of people really enjoy Gary Oldman's Dracula. It's definitely an iconic take. It's been in the pop culture zeitgeist, boob hair and all.
Well, if it isn't little boy.
And, and yes, we've also gotten some pretty terrible versions of Dracula and other, vampire leaders for over a century, including in films like Dracula 2000, which is one of the worst movies, I think, of the 2000s. And, Blade Trinity, absolutely awful, especially where that series began, how it started with, because the original Blade's so good, but Blade Trinity, ooh. And even more recently, Chad, doesn't necessarily star Dracula, but, vampire films. Morbius. I was late to the game when it came to Morbin, chat, but I morbed like everyone else, and I wish I didn't.
It's Morbin time.
Movie was just dull and just didn't have a lot of fun with the vampire mythos. But again, there have been a lot of great Dracula movies, a lot of great vampire movies, and I've always been a fan of vampire movies. And there's a lot you can do with the subgenre. I mean, you have films like Blade, which even though Blade Trinity is pretty bad, but you have films like Blade, which is like, hey, let's incorporate, action aesthetics, into this movie where we can follow this vampire hunter and take on this secret vampire society that rules the world, that rules New York. It's a great comic book adaptation. It's the grandfather of the modern day comic book film. And then you have other things like The Lost Boys, kind of like this punk rock 1980s vampire movie. Kiefer Sutherland, who was absolutely great in that film. Michael.
I'm Michael.
Michael's great. I like Michael. This is Michael.
Michael.
I love that movie. But then you can even incorporate all sorts of other different genres. Like we have What We Do in the Shadows, which is a vampire horror comedy. And, I think that first exposed, certainly me, and I think audiences, to the talents of Taika Waititi. And he had so much fun both honoring but also making fun of the vampire mythos. And then, personally, my favorite vampire film is Near Dark. And in that movie, you just put vampires in the American Southwest and made it this gritty neo-noir, modern day Western chat. You had everyone from, Bill Paxton in there to Lance Henriksen, and it was just a really grisly, nasty film. So, going into this movie, I was curious, for the last voyage of the Demeter, especially because of the film's premise and its focus. For those that don't know, like, I was looking up because I was curious about this movie because it's a really inspired idea, chat. Like, the idea, it's like, hey, instead of, retelling the entire Dracula story again, because I think a lot of us are kind of sick of that, it's like, hey, let's just focus on a single chapter from Bram Stoker's Dracula and expand upon it, right? And that's the captain's log. That's his journey from Carpathia all the way to London, right? And I was like, it's actually kind of cool. And then we can add to the characters, and we can, again, even improve the vampire and Dracula mythos. Like, how's that going to work, like, in an isolated environment? That's kind of cool. It's an interesting idea. The thing is, though, apparently, Chad, the Demeter has a really complicated history, like the making of this movie. There have been apparently many attempts to make this film for the last 20 or so years. You've had new directors, new writers, new actors. They've all been attached to this film at one point. But he kind of finally came together with Andre Overdahl, who is the film's director. And he's probably best known for directing Troll Hunter, which is this really good found footage movie, Chad. I want to say from like either the late 2000s or early 2010s. Really love that movie. Then you have The Autopsy of Jane Doe, which was a really great bottle film where you follow this son and father, and they're being haunted while doing this autopsy in a mortuary. And then more recently, he's probably best known for adapting Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which there's some things I like about the movie, but overall I think that's probably like his weakest film, at least the one that I've seen. Always preferred the books more. But again, I like the idea that with this movie, the whole premise that this is very much an expanded adaptation of the Dracula chapter, Captain's Log. And we're introduced to numerous characters created for the movie, and we actually get to see more of that journey to London. And, there's a lot in this movie that really works for me. And, one of those things is most definitely the cast. The film's lead is Corey Hawkins, who, in case you don't know the name, he's probably best known for playing Dr. Dre from Straight Outta Compton. And he literally plays a doctor in this film. In this movie, we see, like, again, he is a black man living in a time period where it's pretty difficult, but he has been able to obtain a degree. He's pursuing, a position in the medical field, but that's been extraordinarily difficult for him because of his skin color. I think he gets some of the best human moments in the film, and it definitely made all the more worse when he has to deal with a supernatural creature, which goes against his entire belief in science when he's confronted with something that is so supernatural. They just gave him so much to do that I just honestly I didn't expect it, for a movie like this. In lesser hands, he would have just been, I think, a very generic, run-of-the-mill protagonist. I gotta stop Dracula character, but they added more layers to him. And I think that improved the film, certainly when it comes to the characters. Film's female lead, Ashley Franciosi, I think that's, or no, let's go. I think it's,
Today, Junior?
Ashlyn Franciosi, she plays the female lead, and she's actually really good in the movie, especially because she has this history with Dracula that we come to learn about. And, watching the film, you just feel really sorry for her. There's a point where you're just like,
oh man, you fucked.
You're kind of fucked, aren't you? You're in a really precarious situation. I really liked what they did with her in the film, and I loved her chemistry with Corey Hawkins in the film as well. Yeah, she gets some harrowing tasks, Chad. She's confronted with some really vicious realities, but yeah, she does great work with the material that she's given. Liam Cunningham, which you guys have seen in so many other movies and shows, probably best know him as Sir Davos Seaworth from Game of Thrones. He plays the ship's captain, and he's great. He's really solid. He's dealing with something in his life that's kind of driving him crazy, and that in turn is driving the rest of the crew crazy. But he's really good in the movie too. And then you have David Dastmalchian. By the way, I feel like a superhero being able to finally say his name correctly. David Dastmalchian, chat. He plays the Demeter's first mate, and this is kind of a very different role for him because so often he's always kind of played like the nebbish guy, the nerdy guy, the guy that's so often like put upon and across all sorts of films and TV shows. Here he's playing kind of a very aggressive, kind of like piss and vinegar, sailor. And so that was like a little, I think that's different for him, and I think that kind of makes him stand out. He's one of the best character actors working today. And it's crazy to think about it, Chad, seeing him pop up in just so many roles, both even whether it be tertiary or supporting or sometimes, leading or co-leading. But he's really good here. But, it's funny, like, seeing him pop up in everything from Dune to Blade Runner 2049 to James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, Chad. Always consistently good in all those movies. But it makes me go back and think, like, you guys remember when David Dalsmalchian played that one Joker henchman, The Dark Knight, the one that's confronted by Harvey Dent? Like, that performance right there, people were like, wow, he really stands out. And it's funny because after I saw The Dark Knight, like, everyone did in 2008, like, there was a certain commercial playing back during that time. I think it was maybe a couple weeks afterwards, but there was this Wendy's commercial. And in that commercial, David Dalsmalchian was enjoying a juicy Wendy's burger.
How can you make Wendy's crispy chicken nuggets even better?
You can't.
Correct.
I'm just like, this guy's everywhere. So look at the arc of his career, Chad. Appearing in stuff like The Dark Knight, most recently in something like The Last Voyage of Demeter, but Humble Beginnings starring in a Wendy's commercial. And he was goddamn good in that Wendy's commercial. And the thing is, all the actors I think stand out in this movie. But you still have members of the crew of the Demeter, which are very much meant to be meat for Dracula. And speaking of the Count, Dracula is a pure monster in this movie. He is not suave, sophisticated, as so often portrayed in many adaptations. He's very much a horrifically cruel creature that takes absolute pleasure in stalking its prey. Javier Botet is the one that is playing Dracula in this movie, both in makeup and also mocap. Javier Botet is probably best known for probably playing the ghoul creature at the end of Wreck. And I'm like, that is perfect. That is yep, you found the absolute best person to play that role. It's like, watch the end scene of Wreck. Already a great movie, chat, but watch the end scene with Wreck, and it's terrifying. It's really creepy. And I'm like, that guy, perfect for Dracula, and that's who they pretty much got for the movie. But that's the thing about Dracula. Like I said, he is incredibly vicious in this, but he is not human. I mean, so much it's he's almost like a human that became a monster. Here it is. He's just a pure monster through and through. He comes across initially in appearances looking something like Schmeagol, Gollum from Lord of the Rings. How he's crawling around the ship and preying on people, using the darkness and the shadow and the environment, to cover himself up, and as he's stalking his prey. All of that is handled pretty well, I think, for the most part. Certainly initially in the film, I really like, and the makeup they use on him initially is quite good. He just looks so grotesque. He's like, God, don't touch me. Just please, whatever you do, just don't touch me. But he's gonna touch you. And there's a bit of cruelty to him, where he does talk occasionally, but it's used to mock people. There's this one scene where he horrifically just destroys a person's face, and this one guy's like, no, please, no, and Dracula's like, please, no. And he just loves mocking. He just loves throwing it back in someone's face. He's just so despicable and purely evil. He's animalistic in the movie, and we've gotten some interpretation of Dracula where he's been that way, but a lot of times he's more human than monster. In this case, he is straight up a monster, just trying to mimic human speech. And again, I think the makeup in this movie is very good, both for Dracula, for obviously all the prosthetic stuff that they use for the kills. I mean, you get a lot of blood, you get a lot of gore, you get a lot of people getting their face ripped off and smashing the things, Shad, and it's graphic. It's pretty. I was surprised at how violent the movie was. It's like, oh, it's gonna be violent, sure, but whatever. They'll cut away. It's like, no, you'll see some guy, he'll do a double take, and he's like, oh, Dracula, and then Dracula goes, and then grabs onto them and just rips their ass apart. Goes through that thick booty butt meat, Shaq, because we got a lot of blood in the booty butt meat, and he'll just be nomming on some guy's ass. And then, if you happen to survive, well, good luck to you, because you're infected, and if you're exposed to sunlight, this is very much where it's like, hey, if you're exposed to sunlight, it's not going to end well for you, chat. You're going to fucking burn alive, and that's pretty rough. Now, I'm being pretty positive about a lot of this film, and there's a lot to appreciate, and there's a lot of good stuff, going for it. But it does have a few things that didn't work for me. Surprisingly, the film's score I thought was okay. It was fine. And I actually kind of expected better from the film's composer, Bear McCreary, who's probably best known for, at least, people of my generation, for like scoring like the God of War games, God of War 2018, God of War Ragnarok. And I was like, oh, you're gonna get this guy to do the music for this movie? Awesome! And I was like, the score was fine. It was okay. It was serviceable. Chat. It's actually used pretty sparingly in the film. It's not used often, and maybe that's because the score is just kind of like whatever. It serves its purpose, but it didn't instill the amount of dread, or didn't create, like, it wasn't so ominous when it was added to the scene. Thankfully, the cinematography itself and the performances already helped that. But yeah, I was a bit disappointed by the score. Also, and this was a concern with the trailer shit. I think we all had these concerns. The use of CGI in this movie, and it becomes more prevalent as the film goes on, because as Dracula starts to feed, he starts to become more powerful over time. It's just unnecessary in the movie, and it kind of distracts from the actual great practical effects that they were using when he was just a fucking ghoul crawling around the ship. He's so much of his performance, Javier Botet, reminded me of the alien from Ridley Scott's 1979 film. I wonder if that was like a huge inspiration for this movie, because that's the thing. Like, Alien, it takes place, like, primarily on a spaceship, the Nostromo, and, one of the crew members gets infected and births this creature, and then the crew has to deal with it. Very kind of similar situation here, where it's like, no one can leave the Demeter. We're at sea. We're trying to make the trip to London, and we're being preyed upon at night by this creature. We're trying to find it and look for it on this ship. We're also trying to survive, but we're increasingly being exposed to the elements. We're going crazy. We're not trusting each other, and tempers are rising. So it's a very similar premise, and I like that. And that's cool. That's as a foundation, that's great. But it's just, it's the use of the CGI later on in the film, which is like, you don't need to do this. It's completely unnecessary, because you're already working so well. It's like when you had less, it was better. But it's like, well, now that we have CGI, we can make him fly around and do loop-de-loops and shit, and have him jump on someone and throw them into the mast, and then the CGI blood's like, you don't need that. You had some great squibs. You had blood squibs, and you had practical effects, and you smashed a guy's face into the hard floor so hard his skull cracked open, and he looked like a butt. It's like, what are you doing? You don't need the CGI, and so that was unnecessary, and that was kind of frustrating, because I was like, oh wow, I'm liking the practical effects, and they moved away from it for some reason. The movie's also too long. This is a 2-hour movie, which I was shocked. I was like, how long is this film when I was watching it? I didn't check the running time, and this film would be much better if it was just a nice, clean 90 minutes, maybe like an hour 40. There are scenes where I'm like, you can cut this out. You can cut this out. Because there's definitely a lot of scenes where it's like, all right, we need Dracula to kill somebody, so it's the next night, and here's this guy, and he's doing his rounds, and he's like, what? He does a double take, and he gets his ass chewed on. And it's like, listen, as much as I like, scenes of chewing ass, right, as we all do, you can cut some of that ass chewing out. You can cut some of those scenes out, and like the other kills, which, he does kill a lot of, not just the characters that are there to be meat, but he does kill a lot of the main cast. And so at that point, I was like, well, just focus more on that. And then I think you have a much tighter movie. So yeah, I don't know why it's so unnecessarily long. I mean, I can appreciate that. Hey, I want to actually have the main cast have backstories, have a lot to do with each other, where they have a lot of interconnectivity and have conversations, and the relationship change over time. Like, I appreciate all that, but I don't really understand why this film is as long as it is, because it doesn't need to be. It really doesn't need to be 2 hours, and then therefore you can have probably more screenings that way. Because that's the other part of this shit I gotta reveal. I was the only one in the theater watching this movie. I was the only one. Now, I didn't go to the first screening. I didn't go to, my senior citizen screening, 9 a.m., bright and early, I did go to the next screening that I believe it was at 10:45. It was at 10:45 a.m., but I was like, I'm the only one here sitting in it. So that was nice. But even then, like, I've gone to a lot of movies recently this summer, And each one, even at the earliest screenings, like at the very least, half of the theater was filled, chat. And so I was kind of weirded out that I was the only person in the theater watching me. I haven't had that experience in quite some time, but I'm like, oh, that's probably not going to be good for the movie. And that's the thing. Like, this is the summer of Barbie and Oppenheimer, chat, and those two movies are dominating. We've had other releases and they're doing the business that they're doing, but I don't expect this film to do. I don't expect this film to do very well commercially, and critically, by what I'm seeing, it seems to be doing pretty bad too. Although I don't know, I would push back on some of the other reviews. I definitely enjoyed more than I didn't, but it has some flaws. It most certainly does. But I still think it's a really enjoyable creature feature, Chad. It's a really interesting take on Dracula, presenting him in a way which we don't often see in a lot of film adaptations. Again, I like the fact that he is not this suave gentleman. He is a monster, and we're more focused on these other crew members who were never focused on in the original Bram Stoker's novel. It's like we saw everything from the perspective of the captain in his captain's log, the writing about what was going on the ship. And so it's like, hey, you really, you provided more context for that story by showing, like, hey, yes, we know everything about John and Mina Harker and Van Helsing and everything with that, and but now you kind of gave like these people a face and a voice, in that original work, and I can appreciate that. I think that's pretty cool, but it has some flaws. The overuse of CGI, which is completely unnecessary. The kind of generic score, to be honest, and a running time that is too long. Cut 30 minutes out of this, you have a much tighter, much smarter movie. But still, despite that, I did enjoy this movie. I feel like, this might be a few people's like, hey, one of their underrated movies of 2023, one that is worth a watch, whether it be in theater or maybe later on VOD. In any case, it's a different take on the vampire, certainly on the Dracula mythos, and I think it's worth seeing when you have the time. Maybe you can get a private screening like me. But what about you guys? What did you think of the last voyage of the Demeter?
5 minutes later.
Also, one other thing I wanted to mention, the ending to this movie, I have to kind of criticize the ending of this film. It's a little weird, because, well, for those of you who've read Bram Stoker's Dracula, you kind of know what happens to the crew of the Demeter, so it's kind of like this impending doom, this inevitable, right? They definitely play around with that, and in a lot of cases it is tragic. But then it's kind of like, all right, but, the rest of the story is about to set up Dracula, like the rest of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I'm like, are you trying to do are you trying to bait me with a sequel? They get kind of sequel baity at the end. And I was like, I don't think this was necessary to do this, because I don't think it's going to get a sequel. So that was a weird decision on the filmmakers' part. Although, again, I don't even know if the filmmakers wanted to do that. That might have been like a studio note. It's like, make it more hopeful or something, which is like, so much of this movie is so dark and just oppressive in its approach that I don't think giving it almost like a hopeful ending was necessary. So that was kind of weird. You didn't need to sequel bait me. Okay.